SpongeBob SquarePants is the most successful animated series in the history of Nickelodeon. It has been on the air for over 25 years. It has generated billions of dollars in revenue. It has been watched by hundreds of millions of people across every continent on Earth. It is by any reasonable measure one of the safest, most family-friendly entertainment properties ever created. And yet it has been banned, censored, pulled from streaming platforms, edited for international audiences, criticized by advocacy groups, questioned by parents, analyzed by academics, and debated on the internet with an intensity that most actual controversies would envy. Tonight, we are going to explore the most controversial moments in the history of SpongeBob SquarePants, the episodes that got banned, the scenes that got cut, the moments that made people uncomfortable, angry, or genuinely concerned about what their children were watching. And we are going to ask a question that is more interesting than it sounds. Why? Why did these moments generate controversy? What do they tell us about the show? And what do they tell us about ourselves? So settle in, get comfortable, and let us explore the dark, disputed, and surprisingly fascinating underbelly of the most cheerful cartoon on television. Before we dive into specific episodes, it is worth establishing a framework for understanding what makes a children's cartoon controversial in the first place. Because controversy is not an inherent property of content. It is a relationship between content and context. The same joke can be hilarious in one era and offensive in another. The same image can be harmless in one culture and dangerous in another. Controversy exists not in the thing itself, but in the space between the thing and the audience that receives it. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote about what he called the horizon of understanding, the set of assumptions, experiences, and cultural norms that shape how we interpret what we encounter. Every viewer watches SpongeBob through their own horizon of understanding. A child sees one thing, a parent sees another, a cultural critic sees a third. And what is controversial is not the show, but the gap between these different horizons. This is important to keep in mind as we examine the episodes and moments that follow. Each controversy tells two stories simultaneously. It tells the story of what the show depicted, and it tells the story of what the audience brought to the depiction. The second story is always more interesting than the first, because the show is fixed. The episodes exist as they were produced, but the audience is always changing, and the controversies change with them. There is also the question of intentionality. When a SpongeBob episode is controversial, was the controversy intended by the creators? Did Hillenburg and his writers set out to provoke, or did they simply make a joke that they considered harmless, which was then interpreted as offensive by an audience they could not have predicted? In most cases, the answer is that the controversy was unintentional. The creators were making a children's cartoon. They were trying to be funny. They were not trying to make political statements or push cultural boundaries. The boundaries were pushed incidentally, as a byproduct of the show's commitment to honesty, and its willingness to acknowledge aspects of life that other children's shows choose to ignore. But there are exceptions. The episode Sailor Mouth, which we will discuss in detail, was clearly designed to address the topic of profanity. The episode was intentionally provocative, using the concept of forbidden words as both a comedic device and a philosophical exploration. The creators knew what they were doing. They chose to engage with a topic that they knew would generate discussion, and the discussion that followed was, in many ways, exactly what they intended. The distinction between intentional and unintentional controversy matters, because it affects how we evaluate the controversy. A show that deliberately pushes boundaries is making a creative choice that can be evaluated on its merits. A show that accidentally pushes boundaries is a victim of shifting cultural norms, and evaluating it requires a different kind of analysis. SpongeBob contains both kinds of controversy, and understanding which kind we are dealing with, in each case, is essential to understanding what the controversy actually tells us. Let us begin with the most famous banned episode in SpongeBob history, Mid-Life Crustacean. Mid-Life Crustacean originally aired on January 24th, 2003. As part of Season 3. In the episode, Mr. Krabs is feeling old and out of touch. SpongeBob and Patrick take him on a night out to help him feel young again. The evening includes various adventures, culminating in a panty raid, a juvenile prank in which the characters sneak into a woman's home to steal her underwear. The twist comes when they realize that the home they have broken into belongs to Mr. Krabs' mother. The scene ends with Mr. Krabs being grounded by his own mother, a humiliating conclusion that the episode plays for maximum comedic effect. For 15 years, this episode aired regularly on Nickelodeon and was available on streaming platforms without controversy. Millions of children watched it. It was considered a classic. It was part of the golden era canon that fans held up as evidence of the show's creative peak. Then, in 2018, Nickelodeon pulled it. The episode was removed from rotation and from all streaming platforms. The reason given was that the episode was deemed inappropriate for children. Specifically, the panty raid scene was considered to promote behavior that was disrespectful to women and that trivialized the violation of personal space and property. The ban generated enormous discussion. Fans were divided. Some agreed that the panty raid scene was inappropriate and that the ban was overdue. Others argued that the scene was clearly presented as wrong within the episode, that Mr. Krabs is punished for participating, and that removing the episode was an overcorrection that infantilized the audience and denied them the opportunity to learn from a character's mistake. The controversy around midlife crustacean illuminates a fundamental tension in children's media. Should a children's show depict bad behavior in order to show that it is bad? Or does the depiction itself, regardless of context, normalize the behavior in ways that the show's moral framework cannot counteract? This is not a question with a simple answer. The philosopher Plato, writing more than 2,000 years ago, argued that children should not be exposed to stories that depict immoral behavior, even if the stories ultimately condemn that behavior. Plato believed that children learn by imitation, and that exposing them to depictions of immorality would encourage them to imitate what they had seen, regardless of the moral lesson attached. The philosopher Aristotle disagreed. Aristotle argued that the depiction of flawed behavior in art serves a cathartic function. By watching characters make mistakes and suffer consequences, the audience experiences the emotions associated with those mistakes without having to make the mistakes themselves. Art purges the audience of harmful impulses by allowing them to be experienced vicariously. Midlife crustacean stages this ancient debate in the context of a modern children's cartoon. The Platonic position says that the episode should never have been made, because children cannot be trusted to distinguish between the behavior depicted and the behavior endorsed. The Aristotelian position says that the episode serves a valuable function, because it shows a character making a mistake and being punished for it, allowing children to learn without experiencing the consequences themselves. Nickelodeon ultimately sided with Plato. The episode was banned, and the debate continues. The response to the midlife crustacean ban has itself become a cultural artifact. Online forums exploded with debate. YouTube videos analyzing the ban accumulated millions of views. The episode, which had been a beloved but relatively unremarkable part of the SpongeBob canon, became one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history, not because of its content, but because of its removal. This is a phenomenon that the philosopher Michel Foucault would have recognized immediately. Foucault argued that censorship does not simply suppress content, it produces content. By banning midlife crustacean, Nickelodeon did not make the episode disappear. It made the episode famous. The ban transformed a 20-year-old cartoon episode into a symbol of the ongoing cultural debate about what children should and should not be allowed to see. The episode is still widely available through unofficial channels. Fans who had recorded it on VHS or DVR shared it online. It became a kind of underground artifact, more valued for its forbidden status than for its actual content. The ban, intended to protect children from inappropriate material, had the paradoxical effect of drawing more attention to that material than it had ever received during its 15 years of unrestricted broadcast. There is a specific detail about the midlife crustacean controversy that is worth examining. The episode aired for 15 years without controversy. It was produced during the Golden Era, under Steven Hillenburg's direct supervision. It was reviewed by Nickelodeon's Standards and Practices Department before broadcast. It was approved at every level of the production process. And for 15 years, nobody raised a significant objection. What changed was not the episode. What changed was the culture. The standards by which content is evaluated shifted between 2003, when the episode first aired, and 2018, when it was pulled. Behavior that was considered acceptable in 2003 was reconsidered in 2018. A joke that audiences found funny in 2003 was reevaluated as problematic in 2018. There is a particular irony in the fact that the episode was pulled during the same cultural moment that saw widespread reevaluation of content that had previously been considered harmless. Television shows, movies, and comedy specials from earlier eras were being scrutinized through contemporary moral frameworks, and content that had been accepted for decades was being reconsidered and sometimes removed. This phenomenon, which has been described variously as cultural reckoning, cancel culture, or historical revision, depending on one's perspective, raises questions that go far beyond any single episode of any single show. When our moral standards change, should we retroactively apply those new standards to content produced under the old ones? Is it fair to judge a 2003 episode by 2018 standards? And if we do judge it by those standards, what are we saying about the millions of people who watched it without concern during the 15 years it was freely available? These questions do not have easy answers. The philosopher Peter Singer has argued that our circle of moral concern, the set of beings whose well-being we consider morally relevant, has expanded throughout history. We once considered only members of our own tribe morally relevant. Then we expanded to include all humans. Then we expanded further to include animals. Singer argues that this expansion should continue, and that the direction of moral progress is always toward greater inclusivity. SpongeBob's controversies can be read as evidence of this expanding circle of concern. In 2003, a panty raid joke was considered harmless. In 2018, it was considered a violation of women's dignity. The circle of concern had expanded. The set of people whose feelings were considered morally relevant had grown, and content that was produced before the expansion was reevaluated in light of the new, broader standard. This does not mean that the 2018 standard is necessarily correct, and the 2003 standard is necessarily wrong. It means that moral standards evolve, that what counts as harmful changes over time, that the controversies of today may be the non-issues of tomorrow, and the non-issues of today may be the controversies of tomorrow. SpongeBob, by existing across this timeline of moral evolution, serves as a record of how our standards have changed. The episodes that were produced in 1999 reflect the moral standards of 1999. The episodes produced in 2024 reflect the moral standards of 2024. And the gap between them, visible in what was censored, what was banned, and what was debated, is a measure of how far we have come, and a hint of how far we still have to go. The show's very existence as a cultural artifact that spans a quarter century makes it uniquely valuable for understanding moral change. Most cultural works are snapshots, capturing a single moment in time. SpongeBob is a time-lapse, capturing 25 years of continuous cultural evolution. And the changes visible in that time-lapse, the things we once laughed at that we now consider harmful, the things we once ignored that we now consider important, tell a story about who we are becoming that is as compelling as anything the show has ever told about Bikini Bottom. And the fact that they are being debated in the context of a SpongeBob episode demonstrates the extraordinary cultural weight that the show carries. SpongeBob is not just entertainment. It is a mirror. And when the culture changes, the reflection in that mirror changes too. The historian E.P. Thompson wrote about what he called the moral economy, the set of shared assumptions about fairness and propriety that governs a community's expectations. Moral economies shift over time. What is considered fair in one era may be considered exploitative in another. What is considered harmless in one decade may be considered harmful in the next. Midlife crustacean is a casualty of a shifting moral economy. The episode's content did not change, but the moral economy in which it existed changed around it. The standards by which content is evaluated shifted, and an episode that had been acceptable under the old standards became unacceptable under the new ones. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argued that moral progress is real, but that it does not proceed in a straight line. We do not simply move from less moral to more moral in a simple progression. Instead, we oscillate between different moral frameworks, each of which captures certain truths and misses others. The framework that produced Midlife Crustacean captured the truth that children can handle comedic depictions of mild transgression. The framework that banned it captures the truth that some transgressions, even when depicted comedically, normalize behavior that is harmful. Both frameworks contain truth. Neither is complete, and the tension between them is not a problem to be solved, but a conversation to be continued. This shifting standard raises profound questions about the nature of appropriateness. If an episode is appropriate for 15 years and then suddenly inappropriate, was it ever truly appropriate? Or was the harm always present, unrecognized by a culture that had not yet developed the sensitivity to detect it? The philosopher Thomas Kuhn described scientific progress as a series of paradigm shifts, moments when the entire framework through which scientists understand the world is replaced by a new one. Cultural standards undergo similar shifts. The framework through which we evaluate children's media in 2018 is fundamentally different from the framework we used in 2003. And episodes that were produced under the old framework do not always survive the transition to the new one. Midlife Crustacean is a casualty of a paradigm shift. It was produced in a world where panty-raid jokes were considered harmless slapstick. It was banned in a world where the violation of women's personal space is taken more seriously. Neither world is entirely right or entirely wrong, but the shift between them is real, and Midlife Crustacean is the evidence that it happened. There is another episode that deserves attention before we move on. The episode is called Reef Blower, and while it was never banned, it was censored in a way that reveals something interesting about the hidden anxieties of different cultures. Reef Blower, which aired as part of the very first episode in 1999, is almost entirely dialogue-free. SpongeBob uses a reef blower to clean his yard, and the escalating chaos is communicated entirely through visual comedy and sound effects. The episode seems innocuous. There is no offensive content, no violence beyond the slapstick norm, no sexual references, no profanity. And yet the episode was edited in some international markets. Certain visual gags were shortened or removed. The reasons given were vague, relating to concerns about imitable behavior or excessive chaos. But the real reason, one suspects, is that the episode's pure physical comedy was considered too intense for certain cultural contexts, where children's media is expected to maintain a calmer, more controlled tone. This is one of the subtlest forms of censorship, and one of the most revealing. It is not about what the show says. It is about how the show moves. The energy of SpongeBob, the frenetic, joyful, slightly manic energy that defines the show's physical comedy, is itself considered inappropriate in some cultural contexts. The very quality that makes SpongeBob, SpongeBob, its irrepressible vitality, is the quality that some cultures seek to suppress. The second most controversial episode in SpongeBob history is Quarantined Crab, which was produced for season 12 and completed before the COVID-19 pandemic began. The episode depicts the Krusty Krab being placed under quarantine after a customer is suspected of carrying a contagious disease. The characters are trapped inside, unable to leave, and the episode follows their increasingly desperate attempts to maintain order and sanity in confinement. The episode was banned in the United States when the COVID-19 pandemic made its subject matter too close to reality. Depicting quarantine as a comedic situation was deemed insensitive when millions of people were experiencing quarantine as a traumatic reality. The episode aired in France and other countries before the pandemic reached its peak, but it was withheld from American audiences until April 22nd, 2022, when the immediate crisis had subsided. The Quarantined Crab controversy raises a different question from Midlife Crustacean. It is not about whether the content is inappropriate in the abstract. It is about whether content that was appropriate before a particular event can become inappropriate after that event. The episode was produced innocently. Its creators could not have known that a global pandemic was coming. But the pandemic changed the context in which the episode existed. And context, as we will see throughout this discussion, is everything. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that meaning is determined by context. The same sentence, spoken in different situations, can mean completely different things. A joke about quarantine is funny when quarantine is an abstract concept. The same joke becomes painful when quarantine is a lived experience that has caused genuine suffering and death. Quarantined Crab is the same episode whether it airs in 2019 or in 2020. The words are the same. The animation is the same. The jokes are the same. But the meaning is different because the audience is different. The audience of 2020 had lived through something that the audience of 2019 had not. And that experience changed what the episode meant, regardless of what the creators intended. Let us now examine the broader landscape of SpongeBob censorship, because the show has been edited, cut, and modified in dozens of countries for dozens of reasons. And the pattern of censorship reveals as much about global culture as it does about the show itself. SpongeBob SquarePants has been censored in virtually every country where it airs. The reasons vary dramatically. In some countries, scenes are cut for violence. In others, for nudity. In others, for references to alcohol, tobacco, or other substances. In some markets, entire plotlines are removed because they touch on subjects that local authorities consider inappropriate for children. In European markets, censorship tends to focus on violence and physical comedy. Scenes where characters are injured in ways that could be imitated, or where the consequences of violence are depicted too realistically, are often trimmed or removed. In Asian markets, censorship frequently targets content related to death, supernatural elements, and certain cultural references. The depiction of ghosts, skeletons, or the afterlife can trigger censorship in markets where these subjects are considered taboo. In Middle Eastern and North African markets, censorship targets romantic content, gender-related content, and any material that could be interpreted as promoting values inconsistent with local religious or cultural norms. In Australia, the show has been subject to a unique form of censorship that targets content considered too intense for the show's primary viewing time slot. Australian broadcasting standards distinguish between content appropriate for general viewing and content appropriate for children, and SpongeBob episodes are sometimes reclassified between these categories based on their individual content. Episodes with more intense physical comedy or more frightening content may be moved to later time slots, rather than being edited. This approach, which addresses the issue of appropriateness through scheduling rather than editing, reflects a different philosophy of content regulation than the American approach. Rather than modifying the content to fit the time slot, the Australian system modifies the time slot to fit the content. The result is that Australian children may have access to the same episodes as American children, but at different times of day, reflecting a cultural judgment about when children are ready for different levels of intensity. In Germany, SpongeBob has been enormously popular, consistently ranking among the most watched children's programs. German censorship of the show has focused primarily on removing content that could be interpreted as promoting disrespect toward authority, a reflection of German cultural values around orderliness and institutional respect. Scenes where SpongeBob or other characters are openly defiant toward teachers, parents, or other authority figures are sometimes softened or removed for the German market. This is particularly interesting because it suggests that SpongeBob's gentle anarchism, its consistent mockery of institutional authority, is culturally specific rather than universal. What American audiences read as harmless comedy, German regulators read as potentially destabilizing. The same behavior that is considered funny in one culture is considered dangerous in another. In Brazil, the show has been adapted with particular attention to language. The Brazilian Portuguese dubbing of SpongeBob is widely praised as one of the best localizations of any animated show, with voice actors who capture the spirit of the original performances while adapting the humor for Brazilian sensibilities. The cultural adaptation extends beyond language to include the modification of jokes, references, and cultural touchstones that would not resonate with the Brazilian audience. The success of SpongeBob in Brazil demonstrates that the show's appeal transcends its American origins. The core of SpongeBob, its warmth, its humor, its philosophical depth, is universal enough to survive translation into any cultural context. What changes is the surface. The jokes are adapted. The references are updated. The specific cultural anxieties that drive censorship vary. But the heart of the show, the small yellow sponge who loves his life and his friends, is the same everywhere. In the United States, censorship is more subtle. Rather than government-imposed restrictions, American censorship takes the form of network standards, parental advisory groups, and the informal pressure of public opinion. Episodes are not banned by law. They are pulled by the network in response to perceived audience concern. This geographic variation in censorship reveals something profound about the nature of controversy. What is controversial is not a property of the content. It is a property of the relationship between the content and the culture that receives it. The same scene can be innocuous in one culture and outrageous in another. The same joke can be harmless in one context and devastating in another. SpongeBob, by existing in virtually every culture on Earth, exposes these differences with unusual clarity. The show is a constant. The cultures that receive it are variables. And the map of censorship that results is, in effect, a map of global cultural anxiety. A visual representation of what different societies are afraid of and what they are willing to let their children see. The episode Sailor Mouth, which aired on September 21st, 2001, as part of Season 2, is one of the most cleverly constructed episodes in the entire series and one of the most controversial. In the episode, SpongeBob and Patrick discover a word represented by a dolphin sound that is apparently extremely offensive. They do not understand why the word is offensive. They use it innocently and enthusiastically, and the consequences escalate rapidly, with the entire community becoming outraged by their casual deployment of the forbidden word. The episode is a masterclass in the comedy of implication. The audience never hears the actual word. It is always replaced by a dolphin chirp. But the reactions of the characters, their shock, their outrage, their horror, communicate the word's power more effectively than the word itself ever could. This is the philosopher John Langshaw Austin's speech act theory in cartoon form. Austin argued that language does not merely describe reality, it creates reality. Saying certain words does not just express a meaning, it performs an action. The word that SpongeBob and Patrick discover is offensive, not because of its semantic content, but because of its social force. The act of saying it produces effects, shock, anger, punishment, that are independent of what the word literally means. The episode was censored in several markets, with some networks concerned that the implied profanity would encourage children to experiment with profanity themselves. Other networks aired the episode uncut, reasoning that the dolphin chirp was a clever enough substitute that children would not be motivated to seek out the actual word. The debate around Sailor Mouth mirrors the broader debate about profanity in children's media. Is it better to pretend that profanity does not exist, creating an artificially clean linguistic environment? Or is it better to acknowledge the existence of profanity, as Sailor Mouth does, while demonstrating its consequences and its social function? SpongeBob chose acknowledgement over pretense, and the episode's enduring popularity suggests that audiences appreciated the honesty. The episode One Course Meal, which aired on March 25th, 2010, as part of Season 7, is widely considered the most mean-spirited episode in SpongeBob history. In the episode, Mr. Krabs discovers that Plankton is afraid of whales. Krabs exploits this fear by disguising himself as a whale and terrorizing Plankton, driving him to the point of what the episode strongly implies is suicidal ideation. Plankton is shown lying in the road, waiting to be run over. The episode was criticized by fans and parents for its depiction of psychological abuse and its casual treatment of suicidal behavior. The criticism was not that the episode was too dark for a children's show. Many children's shows deal with dark themes. The criticism was that the darkness was not justified by any insight or moral lesson. Mr. Krabs terrorizes Plankton for personal amusement, and the episode does not clearly condemn his behavior. The cruelty is presented as comedy, and the victim's suicidal response is treated as a punchline. This episode is often cited as evidence of the quality decline in the post-movie era. In the golden era, dark humor was always balanced by warmth and empathy. Characters could be cruel, but the show maintained a perspective that recognized cruelty as wrong. One Course Meal lacks this perspective. It presents cruelty without critique, and the result is an episode that feels genuinely unpleasant rather than darkly humorous. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote about the absurd, the gap between the seriousness with which we take our lives and the objective meaninglessness of the universe. Nagel argued that the appropriate response to the absurd is not despair, but irony, the ability to take our situation seriously while simultaneously recognizing its cosmic insignificance. The best SpongeBob episodes achieve this kind of irony. They take their characters' problems seriously while maintaining a light touch that acknowledges the absurdity of the situation. One Course Meal fails because it takes its cruelty seriously without maintaining the ironic distance that would make that cruelty meaningful rather than merely unpleasant. The episode is dark without being illuminating. It is cruel without being insightful. And that combination, darkness without insight, is the definition of gratuitous. Let us now examine some episodes that were controversial, not for what they depicted, but for what they implied. Because some of SpongeBob's most significant controversies are not about explicit content at all, they are about subtext. The episode Rock-a-Bye Bivalve, which aired on March 29th, 2002, as part of Season 2, depicts SpongeBob and Patrick finding a baby scallop and raising it together. SpongeBob takes the role of the stay-at-home parent, feeding, changing, and caring for the baby. Patrick takes the role of the working parent, leaving each day for work and returning exhausted. The episode follows the traditional sitcom template of the domestic partnership, with SpongeBob growing increasingly frustrated by Patrick's failure to help with childcare. The gender dynamics are unmistakable. SpongeBob performs the traditionally female role. Patrick performs the traditionally male role. And the conflict between them mirrors the conflict that real couples experience when domestic labor is distributed unevenly. What makes the episode controversial is not its content, which is relatively mild, but its implications. Two male characters are raising a child together. They are functioning as a family unit. They are experiencing the same joys and frustrations that heterosexual couples experience. And the show presents this arrangement without commentary, without judgment, and without any suggestion that it is unusual or problematic. For viewers who accepted the episode at face value, it was simply a funny story about two friends adopting a pet. For viewers who read more deeply, it was a depiction of same-sex parenting that was remarkably positive and remarkably normalized. The episode does not argue that same-sex parenting is good. It does not argue that it is bad. It simply depicts it. And the normalcy of the depiction is itself the most powerful statement the episode makes. The episode Clams, which aired on May 10th, 2002, as part of Season 3, depicts Mr. Krabs losing his millionth dollar to a giant clam and subsequently going insane with grief. The episode is a direct parody of the film Jaws, with Mr. Krabs in the role of Captain Ahab and the clam in the role of the white whale. The episode is controversial primarily for its depiction of Mr. Krabs' mental deterioration. His obsession with recovering his money leads him to endanger SpongeBob and Squidward, to lie to them, and to sacrifice their safety for his own financial interests. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs getting the dollar back, but losing a significant portion of his body in the process. This is dark comedy of a particularly effective kind. It takes Mr. Krabs' defining trait, his love of money, and pushes it to its absolute extreme, revealing the madness that lies at the heart of unchecked greed. Mr. Krabs does not just want his money, he needs it. He is willing to die for it. He is willing to let others die for it. His relationship with money has crossed the line from desire into pathology. The episode A Pal for Gary, which aired on January 9th, 2010, as part of Season 7, is one of the most controversial episodes in the post-movie era. In it, SpongeBob adopts a dangerous creature as a companion for Gary, despite Gary's obvious terror. SpongeBob ignores every sign that the creature is aggressive and threatening, and he repeatedly blames Gary for the problems that the new pet creates. The episode was widely criticized for its characterization of SpongeBob. In the Golden Era, SpongeBob was attentive to Gary's needs. He loved his pet deeply and responded to Gary's distress with immediate concern. In A Pal for Gary, SpongeBob is oblivious to Gary's suffering in a way that feels inconsistent with his established character. He is not just naive, he is negligent. And the episode's refusal to have SpongeBob recognize his negligence or apologize for it left many viewers feeling that the character had been fundamentally miswritten. This episode is often cited as evidence of the Flanderization that affected SpongeBob's characters in the post-movie era. SpongeBob's naivety, which in the early seasons was balanced by genuine emotional intelligence, was amplified to the point where it became a form of cruelty. He was so naive that he could not see Gary's suffering, and the audience, who could see it clearly, felt the frustration that Gary must have felt. The comedy did not work because the audience was not laughing with SpongeBob. They were angry at him. The episode Demolition Doofus, which aired on July 21st, 2012, as part of Season 8, generated controversy for its depiction of Mrs. Puff. In the episode, SpongeBob's driving crashes cause Mrs. Puff's inflation sack to deflate permanently. Unable to puff up, Mrs. Puff loses the defining physical characteristic that has been part of her identity since the show began. The episode takes a dark turn when Mrs. Puff enters SpongeBob into a demolition derby, hoping that the other drivers will destroy him. The episode implies that Mrs. Puff wants SpongeBob dead. Not metaphorically, literally. She has been pushed so far past her breaking point by years of SpongeBob's destructive driving that she has crossed the line into homicidal intent. This is disturbing, not because it is unrealistic, but because it is too realistic. Teachers do reach breaking points. Authority figures do snap under pressure. The systems that are supposed to support them fail, and the result is rage, despair, and sometimes violence. Mrs. Puff's homicidal intent is not random. It is the logical endpoint of a system that has been failing her for years. The episode was controversial because it presented this reality within the context of a children's comedy. The audience was being asked to laugh at a teacher who wanted to kill her student. And some viewers could not laugh because the premise was too close to a reality that was not funny at all. The episode Ink Lemonade, which aired on July 7th, 2018, as part of Season 11, generated controversy for its gross-out content. The episode depicts Patrick selling lemonade that is actually Squidward's ink, which he produces involuntarily when scared. Patrick repeatedly terrifies Squidward to produce more ink, which he then serves to customers. The episode was criticized on multiple fronts, for its extended scenes of Squidward's terror and humiliation, for its celebration of Patrick's exploitation of another character's distress, for its visual gross-out humor, which many viewers found genuinely unpleasant rather than funny, and for its overall tone, which seemed to find humor in cruelty in a way that the Golden Era episodes never did. The debate around Ink Lemonade reflects a broader debate about the direction of children's comedy. As slapstick humor has become less effective at generating laughs, many shows have turned to gross-out humor as a replacement. But gross-out humor operates differently from slapstick. Slapstick is about surprise and timing. Gross-out is about disgust and endurance. Slapstick makes you laugh. Gross-out makes you react. And the difference between the two is the difference between comedy that celebrates the absurdity of the human body and content that exploits it. The episode The Splinter from Season 6, which we mentioned earlier, is the paradigmatic example of gross-out replacing slapstick. SpongeBob gets a splinter, and the episode devotes extended screen time to the increasingly grotesque visual of the wound. The comedy is derived not from timing or surprise, but from the viewer's physical discomfort. The longer you watch, the more uncomfortable you become. And the discomfort is the point. Some viewers find this kind of humor funny, others find it unwatchable. And the divide between these two groups has become one of the most contentious debates in the SpongeBob fan community, with Golden Era purists arguing that gross-out humor represents a fundamental betrayal of the show's original sensibility, and post-movie defenders arguing that the show has always contained physical comedy and that the intensity has simply been calibrated for a new generation of viewers. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. The golden era contained gross-out elements. The post-movie era contains episodes of genuine quality. The line between slapstick and gross-out is not as clear as either side wants to believe, but the overall trend is undeniable. The show's comedy became more physically intense and more focused on disgust over time. And whether this represents evolution or decline is a question that each viewer must answer for themselves. The episode Squid Baby, which aired on September 3rd, 2012, as part of Season 9, generated controversy for its depiction of Squidward regressing to an infant-like state after a head injury. Squidward loses his adult faculties and behaves like a baby, requiring SpongeBob and Patrick to care for him. The episode was criticized for its perceived mockery of traumatic brain injury, and for the discomfort of watching a character lose their autonomy and dignity. The episode raises questions about the ethics of comedy. Is any subject inherently off-limits for humor? Can a cartoon make fun of brain injury without trivializing the experiences of real people who have suffered brain injuries? These questions do not have definitive answers, but the intensity of the response to Squid Baby suggests that the episode crossed a line that many viewers considered important. The episode SpongeBob You're Fired, which aired on November 11th, 2013, as part of Season 9, generated controversy not for its content, but for its perceived political message. The episode depicts SpongeBob being fired from the Krusty Krab and attempting to find work at other restaurants. Some commentators interpreted the episode as a commentary on the real-world unemployment crisis, with SpongeBob's struggles representing the experiences of millions of people who had lost their jobs during the economic downturn. The controversy was amplified when media outlets began running stories about the episode, some praising it for addressing economic anxiety in a way that children could understand, others criticizing it for trivializing unemployment or for promoting a particular political perspective. The episode itself is relatively mild, but the cultural context in which it aired, a context of high unemployment and heated political debate about the role of government in the economy, transformed a simple cartoon plot into a political lightning rod. This is another example of context determining controversy. SpongeBob being fired is, within the world of the show, a comedic premise. But in a world where millions of people were actually being fired, the premise became something more charged. The episode did not change. The world did. Let us now talk about the show's depiction of violence, because this is an area where SpongeBob has been consistently controversial throughout its run. SpongeBob contains a great deal of cartoon violence. Characters are hit, crushed, flattened, stretched, burned, frozen, electrocuted, and subjected to various other forms of physical abuse. In the Golden Era, this violence was presented in the tradition of classic cartoon slapstick, exaggerated, consequence-free, and clearly unrealistic. Characters bounced back immediately from injuries that would be fatal in the real world. In the post-movie era, the violence became more intense and more mean-spirited. Characters were injured in ways that were played for gross-out humor rather than slapstick comedy. The injuries were more detailed, more prolonged, and more focused on the victim's suffering rather than on the comic timing of the impact. The episode Splinter from Season 6 is perhaps the most extreme example. SpongeBob gets a wooden splinter lodged in his thumb, and the episode devotes extensive screen time to the injury, which becomes increasingly infected, swollen, and visually revolting. The episode was criticized for its reliance on body horror, and for the duration of its focus on physical suffering. This shift in the nature of the show's violence reflects a broader trend in children's media. As audiences became desensitized to traditional slapstick, creators felt the need to escalate, to find new ways to provoke the shock and laughter that mild cartoon violence once reliably produced. The result was a form of violence that was more intense but less funny, because it relied on disgust rather than surprise. The philosopher Sigmund Freud wrote about the relationship between humor and aggression. Freud argued that humor allows us to express aggressive impulses in socially acceptable ways. A joke about violence is a safe way to experience the thrill of transgression without actually transgressing. But when the humor disappears and only the aggression remains, the social contract is broken. The audience is no longer laughing at violence. They are watching violence, and the experience shifts from cathartic to uncomfortable. The best SpongeBob episodes maintain the humor in their violence. The worst ones lose it. And the difference between the two is the difference between comedy that uses violence and content that merely depicts it. Let us also examine the show's treatment of themes that are controversial, not because they are explicit, but because they are implicit. Themes that the show addresses, not through dialogue or plot, but through the structure of its world and the dynamics of its characters. The class dynamics of Bikini Bottom are a prime example. Mr. Krabs exploits SpongeBob. This is not subtext, it is text. SpongeBob works long hours for minimal pay in a restaurant that generates enormous profit for its owner. Mr. Krabs hoards wealth while his employees struggle. The economic structure of the Krusty Krab is, by any objective measure, unjust. And yet SpongeBob does not resist. He does not organize. He does not demand better wages or better conditions. He accepts the exploitation with a smile, and the show presents his acceptance as endearing rather than concerning. This has led some critics to argue that SpongeBob promotes a passive acceptance of economic injustice, that by depicting a happy, willing worker in an exploitative system, the show normalizes exploitation and discourages resistance, that SpongeBob is, in effect, capitalist propaganda. A cheerful, colorful argument for the proposition that workers should be grateful for whatever they are given. This criticism has merit, but it also misses something important. SpongeBob's happiness at the Krusty Krab is not a product of ignorance or brainwashing. It is a product of his relationship with his craft. SpongeBob does not love his job because Mr. Krabs treats him well. He loves his job because cooking Krabby Patties is inherently meaningful to him. The exploitation exists, and it is real, but it does not define SpongeBob's experience, because SpongeBob has found something in his work that transcends the economic relationship. The philosopher Karl Marx distinguished between alienated labor, work that is meaningless to the worker, and unalienated labor, work that is an expression of the worker's essential nature. SpongeBob's labor is unalienated. He is not working for money. He is working for meaning. And while this does not excuse Mr. Krabs' exploitation, it does complicate the simple narrative that SpongeBob is a victim. The show also raises implicit questions about gender and sexuality that have been the subject of ongoing controversy. SpongeBob's close relationships with male characters, particularly Patrick, have been interpreted by some viewers as homoerotic. SpongeBob's flamboyant personality, his love of fashion and aesthetics, his emotional expressiveness, these traits have led to speculation about his sexuality. As we mentioned earlier, Steven Hillenburg stated that SpongeBob is asexual, but the speculation persists, in part because the show does not conform to traditional gender norms, and in part because our culture is deeply invested in categorizing every character along lines of sexual orientation. The controversy around SpongeBob's sexuality reveals more about our culture's anxieties than about the show's content. SpongeBob is a character who expresses affection openly and without the defensive irony that traditionally masculine characters typically employ. He hugs his friends. He tells them he loves them. He cries when he is sad. He dances when he is happy. These behaviors, which are simply human behaviors expressed without inhibition, are interpreted as queer because our culture has gendered emotional expression to such an extent that a male character who is emotionally open is automatically suspect. The fact that SpongeBob's emotional openness is controversial tells us something important about the gender norms that our culture enforces, even in children's media. Boys are expected to be stoic, reserved, and physically rather than emotionally expressive. A boy who cries, who hugs, who dances, who tells his friends he loves them, violates these norms. And the violation, even in a cartoon, generates anxiety. SpongeBob's gender nonconformity is not a statement. It is not a political position. It is simply who the character is. And the controversy that surrounds it is not about SpongeBob. It is about us. about our inability to accept emotional openness in male characters without interpreting it as a sexual statement, about our deep, culturally ingrained belief that masculinity and tenderness are incompatible. The show has never directly addressed these controversies. It has never declared SpongeBob's sexuality. It has never made his gender expression a plot point. It has simply continued to depict a character who is emotionally open, affectionate, and unashamed of his feelings. And the fact that this depiction continues to generate debate, a quarter of a century after the show premiered, tells us that the cultural norms SpongeBob quietly challenges are still firmly in place. Let us now discuss the most recent category of SpongeBob controversy, which involves not the show's content, but its legacy. Specifically, the debate over whether the post-Hillenburg era represents a legitimate continuation of the show or a corporate exploitation of its brand. Steven Hillenburg, as we have discussed, opposed the creation of SpongeBob spin-offs and expressed concern about the show continuing without his creative oversight. His wishes have been publicly documented, and yet, after his death, Nickelodeon produced not one, but 2 spin-off series, along with additional movies and specials. This has generated significant controversy among fans who feel that the network is disrespecting Hillenburg's legacy by producing content he explicitly opposed. The counter-argument, made by Nickelodeon and by some fans, is that the characters belong to a community that extends beyond any individual creator, and that new stories can honor the spirit of the original while expanding in new directions. This debate touches on fundamental questions about authorship, ownership, and the nature of creative legacy. Does a creator have the right to determine the future of their creation after their death? Or does the creation take on a life of its own, becoming the property of the culture rather than the individual? These questions do not have easy answers, and the fact that they are being debated in the context of a cartoon about a sponge demonstrates once again the extraordinary cultural significance that SpongeBob SquarePants has achieved. The show that was created to entertain children has become a site of genuine philosophical, political, and cultural debate. The show that was designed to make people laugh has become a mirror in which entire societies see their anxieties reflected. The show that was intended to be harmless has become, by the simple fact of its longevity and its ubiquity, one of the most consequential cultural artifacts of our time. And the controversies that have surrounded it, from midlife crustacean to quarantined crab to the post-Hillenburg spin-offs, are not flaws in the show's legacy. They are features of it. They are the evidence that SpongeBob SquarePants matters, that it has penetrated so deeply into the culture that people care enough to argue about it, that a cartoon about a sponge has become important enough to ban, to censor, to debate, and to defend, and that, more than any individual episode, is the most controversial thing about SpongeBob SquarePants. Not what it says, but the fact that what it says matters. Let us now examine a category of SpongeBob controversy that has received less attention than the banned episodes, but that is, in many ways, more significant. The controversy over how the show depicts mental health and psychological distress. SpongeBob SquarePants is, on the surface, a cheerful show. Its protagonist is relentlessly optimistic. Its world is bright and colorful. Its comedy is designed to produce joy. But beneath this cheerful surface, the show contains depictions of psychological distress that are remarkably honest and sometimes genuinely disturbing. The character of Squidward Tentacles is the show's primary vehicle for depicting depression. Squidward is, by any clinical standard, a depressed individual. He takes no pleasure in his work. He has no meaningful social connections. He has abandoned the creative aspirations that once defined him. He spends his free time in isolation, engaging in activities that he clearly does not enjoy, going through the motions of a life that has ceased to have meaning. The show plays Squidward's depression for laughs. His misery is presented as a comic counterpoint to SpongeBob's joy. His failure to appreciate the good things in his life is depicted as a character flaw rather than a clinical condition. And this comedic treatment of depression has been criticized by some viewers and mental health advocates who argue that it trivializes a serious condition and reinforces the harmful idea that depressed people are simply negative, ungrateful, or insufficiently motivated. This criticism is valid, but it is also incomplete, because the show, in its better moments, treats Squidward's depression with genuine empathy. Episodes like Dying for Pie and Christmas Who reveal that Squidward's coldness is a defense mechanism, not an identity. That beneath the irritation and the snobbery, there is a person who is capable of love, of generosity, of genuine human connection. The show does not fix Squidward's depression. It does not pretend that a single act of kindness can cure a lifetime of unhappiness. But it shows, again and again, that connection is possible, even for the most disconnected among us. And that glimpse of possibility is, for viewers who struggle with depression, potentially more therapeutic than any overt message about seeking help. The episode SpongeBob's Depression, an unofficial name given by fans to various episodes that depict SpongeBob in uncharacteristically low emotional states, reveals that even the show's most optimistic character is not immune to sadness. SpongeBob cries. SpongeBob despairs. SpongeBob loses confidence in himself and in his abilities. These moments are brief and always resolved by the end of the episode, but their existence is important. They say that even the happiest person in the world has bad days. That joy is not a permanent state, but a practice that requires effort, and that can, sometimes, falter. The episode Plankton's Regular, which we have discussed in other contexts, depicts a form of psychological distress that is rarely acknowledged in any medium. The distress of having something good happen when you do not believe you deserve it. Plankton has spent his entire life believing that he is worthless, that his food is terrible, that nobody could possibly appreciate what he has to offer. When evidence to the contrary appears, when a customer actually enjoys his food, Plankton cannot accept it. He investigates, interrogates, and ultimately destroys the very thing that might have saved him. This is a devastating portrait of self-sabotage driven by low self-esteem, and it is controversial precisely because it is so accurate. Many viewers recognize themselves in Plankton's behavior, in the tendency to reject good fortune because it does not match our self-image, in the compulsion to prove that we are as worthless as we believe ourselves to be. The episode holds up a mirror, and the reflection is uncomfortable. The episode Rock Bottom, which aired on March 15th, 2000, as part of Season 1, depicts SpongeBob alone in a strange, dark city where he does not understand the language or the customs of the inhabitants. The episode can be read as a metaphor for anxiety disorder, for the experience of finding yourself in a world that operates according to rules you cannot comprehend, surrounded by people who seem to understand something that you do not, unable to find your way home. The genius of Rock Bottom is that it depicts this anxiety from the inside. We experience SpongeBob's confusion and fear not as observers, but as participants. The episode does not explain what is happening. It simply places us in the experience and lets us feel it. And for viewers who have experienced the disorientation of anxiety, the episode provides a form of validation that is difficult to find elsewhere. It says, "This feeling is real. This feeling has a shape. And even though it is terrifying, it is survivable." Let us also examine the controversy surrounding the show's treatment of authority figures, because this is an area where SpongeBob has been consistently and quietly subversive. Every authority figure in SpongeBob SquarePants is flawed. Mr. Krabs is greedy and exploitative. Mrs. Puff is exhausted and ineffective. The police are incompetent. The government is absent. King Neptune, the closest thing Bikini Bottom has to a supreme authority, is vain, petulant, and frequently wrong. This universal mockery of authority is controversial because it undermines the respect for authority that many parents want their children to develop. If every teacher is incompetent, if every boss is exploitative, if every government official is corrupt, what message does this send to young viewers about the institutions that shape their lives? The counter-argument is that SpongeBob's mockery of authority is not cynicism, it is realism. Authority figures are flawed, institutions are imperfect, and teaching children to recognize these flaws, rather than pretending they do not exist, is better preparation for the real world than blind deference could ever be. The philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that the health of a democracy depends on the willingness of citizens to question authority. A population that defers to authority without question is a population that can be led anywhere, including toward its own destruction. SpongeBob, by presenting authority figures as fallible and institutions as imperfect, encourages the kind of healthy skepticism that Mill considered essential to a free society. But there is a deeper layer to the show's treatment of authority that is worth examining. Despite mocking every authority figure, SpongeBob himself is not an anarchist. He respects Mr. Krabs. He obeys Mrs. Puff, or at least tries to. He follows the rules of Bikini Bottom society, even when those rules are absurd. His skepticism toward authority does not translate into rejection of authority. He mocks the person while respecting the position. This distinction between the authority of an institution and the competence of the person who occupies it is one of the most sophisticated political ideas in the entire show. It says that you can respect the office of teacher while recognizing that the specific teacher is exhausted and ineffective. That you can respect the institution of business while recognizing that the specific boss is exploitative. That authority deserves respect in principle, but must earn respect in practice. This is a mature political philosophy. It is more nuanced than either blind deference or blanket rejection. And it is delivered to children through a cartoon about a sponge who works at a fast food restaurant, which is, when you think about it, an extraordinary achievement. The show's depiction of food safety and the restaurant industry has generated its own category of controversy. The Krusty Krab is, by any regulatory standard, a health code nightmare. The kitchen is not clean. The ingredient sourcing is questionable. Mr. Krabs has been shown serving spoiled food, recycling ingredients, and prioritizing profit over the safety of his customers. These depictions are played for comedy, but they have been criticized by some public health advocates who argue that normalizing poor food safety practices in a children's show could influence children's attitudes toward hygiene and food preparation. The criticism is probably overstated, since most children understand the difference between a cartoon kitchen and a real one, but it illustrates the scrutiny that a show as prominent as SpongeBob attracts, where every detail is analyzed for its potential influence on young minds. The episode Nasty Patty, which aired on March 1st, 2002, as part of Season 3, takes the food safety theme to its darkest extreme. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs intentionally poison a Krabby Patty in an attempt to prank a health inspector they believe is a fraud. When the inspector appears to die after eating the patty, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs attempt to hide the body. The episode is a masterclass in dark comedy. It takes a premise that would be horrifying in a realistic context, food poisoning and body disposal, and plays it with a comedic timing and a cartoonish exaggeration that transforms horror into hilarity. The health inspector is not actually dead. The poison does not actually kill him. But the characters believe they have committed murder, and their panicked response to this belief drives the comedy. Nasty Patty is controversial because it depicts protagonists committing what they believe to be a criminal act. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are not villains. They are the characters we are supposed to root for, and yet in this episode, they poison someone and attempt to cover it up. The show trusts its audience to understand that this behavior is wrong, even though the characters are engaging in it. It trusts its audience to separate their feelings about the characters from their moral evaluation of the characters' actions. This is a significant amount of moral complexity for a children's show to expect from its audience. And the fact that the episode is universally regarded as one of the show's funniest and best written suggests that the trust was justified. Children can handle moral complexity. They can root for a character while understanding that the character's actions are wrong. They do not need to be shielded from the depiction of bad behavior. They need to be given the tools to evaluate it. The entire show's relationship with food is philosophically interesting. SpongeBob treats cooking as a sacred act. The Krabby Patty is, for him, not just a product, but an expression of who he is. And the contrast between SpongeBob's reverence for his craft And Mr. Krabs' treatment of the same product as a commodity, as nothing more than a means of generating profit, is one of the show's most persistent themes. This contrast between craft and commodity is the central tension of modern capitalism. The person who makes a thing cares about its quality. The person who sells a thing cares about its price. And the system that connects them, the market, does not distinguish between quality and price. It treats both as variables in an equation to be optimized for maximum profit. SpongeBob resists this equation. He insists that quality matters independently of price, that a well-made Krabby Patty is inherently better than a poorly made one, regardless of whether the customer can tell the difference. This insistence is, in the context of the show's economic landscape, a form of rebellion. SpongeBob is a craftsman in a system that has no use for craftsmen, and his refusal to compromise his craft, his insistence on making every patty with love even when the system does not reward it, is one of the most quietly radical things about the show. The philosopher Matthew Crawford, in his book Shop Class as Soulcraft, argued that manual work, the kind of work that involves making things with your hands, is essential to human flourishing. Crawford argued that our culture's emphasis on abstract, intellectual work has impoverished our relationship with the physical world and has denied millions of people the satisfaction that comes from making something well. SpongeBob embodies Crawford's argument. He is a manual worker. He makes things with his hands, or his sponge equivalent of hands, and the satisfaction he derives from his work is more profound, more genuine, and more lasting than anything that the more prestigious characters in the show achieve through their more socially valued pursuits. Squidward is an artist, but he is not satisfied. Mr. Krabs is a businessman, but he is not secure. Sandy is a scientist, but she is often lonely. SpongeBob is a fry cook, and he is complete. He has found, in the humble act of making hamburgers, a fullness of meaning that the show's more ambitious characters spend their lives searching for and never find. This is controversial because it challenges the cultural hierarchy that places intellectual work above manual work, creative work above service work, thinking above doing. SpongeBob suggests that this hierarchy is wrong, that the person who makes a good hamburger with love and skill is doing work that is as valuable and as meaningful as the work of any artist, scientist, or philosopher. And that suggestion, quiet and unassuming as it is one of the most radical things any children's show has ever proposed. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about the vita activa, the life of action, and distinguished between three forms of human activity. Labor, which is the work of maintaining our biological existence. Work, which is the fabrication of objects that outlast us. And action, which is the exercise of freedom in the public sphere. SpongeBob's cooking is all three simultaneously. It is labor, because it sustains the citizens of Bikini Bottom. It is work, because each Krabby Patty is a crafted object, however temporary. And it is action, because SpongeBob's commitment to his craft is a public statement about what matters, a demonstration of values that influences everyone who encounters it. Most people experience these three activities as separate. They labor at jobs they do not enjoy. They work on projects that do not express their deepest values. And they act, in the political sense, only occasionally, if at all. SpongeBob collapses these distinctions. For him, labor, work, and action are the same thing. Cooking a Krabby Patty is maintaining his biological existence, creating an enduring craft, and exercising his freedom simultaneously. This integration of labor, work, and action is, according to Arendt, the definition of a fulfilled human life. And the fact that SpongeBob achieves it through the humble act of fry cooking is the show's most powerful argument against the cultural hierarchy that places certain forms of work above others. The controversy, such as it is, lies in the implication. If a fry cook can achieve complete human fulfillment, then the entire system of status and prestige that organizes our society is called into question. If SpongeBob is more fulfilled than Squidward the artist, more fulfilled than Mr. Krabs the entrepreneur, more fulfilled than Sandy the scientist, then what does that say about our culture's assumption that artistic, entrepreneurial, and scientific work is inherently superior to service work? It says that the assumption is wrong, and that is a controversial claim, even when it is delivered by a cartoon sponge in a cartoon kitchen at the bottom of a cartoon ocean, because the claim does not just challenge a preference, it challenges a system that distributes respect, opportunity, and dignity according to the perceived prestige of one's occupation. A system that tells fry cooks and janitors and cleaning staff that their work is less valuable than the work of executives and professors and politicians. SpongeBob says their work is not less valuable. SpongeBob says their work can be the foundation of a complete, meaningful, deeply fulfilled life. And the system, which depends on the opposite belief to maintain its hierarchy, finds this message profoundly threatening, even when it arrives in the least threatening form imaginable. A cartoon about a sponge who flips burgers. The most subversive show on television. Good night. Sleep well. And the next time you find yourself in a controversy, remember that even SpongeBob, the most cheerful character on television, has not been able to avoid one, because controversy is not the opposite of innocence. It is the evidence of significance. And SpongeBob is nothing if not significant. Let us spend some more time with specific episodes that pushed boundaries in ways that generated debate, because each one tells us something different about what our culture considers acceptable and what it considers dangerous. The episode Gary Takes a Bath, which aired on July 26, 2002, as part of Season 3, contains a moment that has become infamous among SpongeBob fans. In an attempt to convince Gary to take a bath, SpongeBob shows Gary what appear to be two bar-shaped figures made of soap. SpongeBob says, "I'm a dirty boy," and the camera cuts to Gary, looking unimpressed. The implication of the scene is, depending on your interpretation, either a simple joke about soap or a sexual innuendo that should not appear in a children's show. The scene has been analyzed extensively online, with some viewers insisting that the bars are just soap and others arguing that the framing, the line delivery, and the cutaway to Gary's reaction make the sexual interpretation unavoidable. This is a perfect example of the dual audience joke, a joke that children interpret innocently, while adults detect a more suggestive reading. SpongeBob contains many such jokes, moments that operate on two levels simultaneously, with the surface level being entirely appropriate for children and the deeper level being visible only to older viewers who bring their own experiences and associations to the material. The question is whether dual audience jokes are appropriate in children's media. The Platonic view would say no, that children's media should contain only content that is appropriate at every level of interpretation. The Aristotelian view would say yes, that layered content rewards repeated viewing, and that the presence of adult humor does not contaminate the children's experience as long as the surface level remains clean. SpongeBob has consistently taken the Aristotelian position, and the show's enormous success with audiences of all ages suggests that the Aristotelian position is the correct one. Children watch SpongeBob and see slapstick comedy. Adults watch SpongeBob and see philosophical depth, cultural satire, and the occasional risque joke. Both audiences are satisfied. Both audiences are watching the same show. And the fact that the show works on multiple levels simultaneously is one of its greatest strengths. The episode Squirrel Jokes, which aired on November 13th, 1999, as part of Season 1, tackled the subject of ethnic humor with surprising directness. SpongeBob performs a stand-up comedy routine in which he tells jokes about squirrels, specifically about Sandy. The jokes rely on stereotypes, depicting squirrels as stupid and backward. Sandy is hurt by the jokes, and the episode follows the consequences of SpongeBob's thoughtless humor. The episode is a straightforward allegory for racial humor and ethnic stereotyping. Sandy represents any marginalized group that is the butt of mainstream jokes. SpongeBob represents the well-meaning person who tells those jokes without understanding the harm they cause. And the episode's resolution, in which Sandy forces SpongeBob to experience what it feels like to be stereotyped, provides a lesson about empathy that is both effective and earned. The episode was praised for its handling of a sensitive topic and for its willingness to address the real-world phenomenon of ethnic humor within the context of a children's cartoon. But it was also criticized by some who felt that the episode's depiction of stereotyping could itself reinforce stereotypes. That by showing SpongeBob telling squirrel jokes, the show was putting those jokes into the audience's mind, even if the episode ultimately condemned them. This is the same paradox that we encountered with midlife crustacean. Can a show depict harmful behavior in order to condemn it without also normalizing that behavior? The answer depends on whether you trust the audience to distinguish between depiction and endorsement. SpongeBob trusts its audience. Not everyone agrees that the trust is warranted. The episode Dying for Pie, which we have discussed in other contexts, contains a moment that is worth examining from the perspective of controversy. When Squidward believes that SpongeBob is about to die, he asks SpongeBob to list the things he wants to do before he dies. SpongeBob's list is modest. He wants to blow bubbles. He wants to ride seahorses. He wants to watch the sunset. With Squidward, these are small, simple pleasures. And the fact that they constitute SpongeBob's dying wishes is both funny and deeply moving. But the episode also depicts the concept of imminent death in a children's show. Squidward believes, sincerely, that his neighbor and coworker is going to die within hours. He experiences genuine grief. He cries. He mourns. And while the episode resolves happily, the emotional journey it takes the audience on is real. The grief is real. The confrontation with mortality is real. This is controversial for some parents who believe that children should not be exposed to the concept of death in their entertainment. But the philosopher Irvin Yalom, whom we have mentioned before, argues that the confrontation with death is essential to living a meaningful life. That the awareness of mortality, far from being traumatic, is what gives life its urgency and its value. Without the knowledge that life will end, life has no weight. It is only because we know we will die that we bother to live. SpongeBob introduces this awareness gently, through comedy, through characters who are clearly cartoon characters in a clearly cartoon world, through situations that are obviously fictional and obviously resolvable. But the awareness is there, and for the child who is beginning to understand that life is finite, the episode provides a context in which to process that understanding, a safe space where death can be contemplated without terror. The episode Are You Happy Now?, which aired on March 31st, 2012, as part of Season 8, generated controversy for its depiction of what many viewers interpreted as suicidal behavior. In the episode, Squidward is profoundly unhappy and cannot find anything that makes him feel better. In one scene, he is shown reaching into a closet in a way that suggests he might be reaching for a rope. In another scene, he is shown putting his head inside an oven. Both scenes are resolved innocently. Squidward pulls a bag of chips from the closet. He pulls a batch of brownies from the oven. But the framing, the pacing, and the visual composition of the scenes make the suicidal interpretation unmistakable. The show is deliberately invoking the imagery of suicide and then subverting it, creating a moment of genuine tension before revealing the innocent truth. This is, by any standard, a bold creative choice for a children's show, and it was controversial precisely because it was effective. The audience felt the tension. They genuinely worried for a moment that Squidward was going to harm himself, and while the resolution was comedic, the moment of worry was real. The debate around these scenes reflects the broader debate about how children's media should handle topics like depression and suicide. Should these topics be avoided entirely, on the grounds that children are too young to process them? Or should they be addressed, even indirectly, in the hope that early exposure will normalize the conversation and reduce the stigma that prevents people from seeking help? There is no consensus on this question, but the fact that SpongeBob raised it, in a show watched by millions of children, ensures that the question remains part of the cultural conversation. Let us also examine the show's controversial engagement with the supernatural and the occult. SpongeBob SquarePants contains a surprising amount of supernatural content for a show that is ostensibly set in a natural undersea environment. Ghosts, vampires, zombies, demonic entities, and various other supernatural beings appear throughout the series. The Flying Dutchman is the most prominent supernatural character. He is a ghost pirate who haunts Bikini Bottom, appearing in multiple episodes across the show's run. He is feared by the citizens of Bikini Bottom, but is also, in many episodes, depicted as lonely, petty, and fundamentally unthreatening. His supernatural powers are real within the show's logic, but his personality is decidedly mundane. The Flying Dutchman episodes have been censored in some markets where depictions of ghosts and the supernatural are considered inappropriate for children. In these markets, the belief that ghosts are real or that they can be depicted in a positive or comedic light conflicts with religious or cultural norms that treat the supernatural as either sacred or dangerous. The episode Graveyard Shift, which we have discussed extensively, uses genuine horror techniques to create atmosphere. The episode builds tension through lighting, sound design, pacing, and the gradual accumulation of dread. These are the same techniques used in adult horror films, calibrated for a younger audience, but fundamentally the same in their mechanics. The episode Scaredy Pants, which aired on October 28, 1999, as part of Season 1, was the show's first Halloween episode. In it, SpongeBob attempts to be scary for Halloween, but instead becomes the victim of the Flying Dutchman's genuine supernatural wrath. The episode ends with a visual revelation: SpongeBob, without his square shape, revealed as a round sponge that was designed to be surprising and slightly unsettling. These supernatural elements serve a function that extends beyond plot mechanics. They remind the audience that the world of Bikini Bottom, however cheerful and familiar, contains forces that are beyond understanding and beyond control. The supernatural in SpongeBob is a metaphor for the unknown, for the aspects of existence that cannot be explained by reason or science, for the irreducible mystery at the heart of being alive. The philosopher Rudolf Otto described religious experience as an encounter with what he called the numinous, a reality that is simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, that draws us in even as it overwhelms us. The supernatural episodes of SpongeBob, at their best, produce a mild version of this numinous experience. They fascinate and unsettle simultaneously. They remind us that the world is stranger than our everyday experience suggests, and they do this within the safe confines of a cartoon, allowing children to encounter the unknown without being overwhelmed by it. The show's relationship with holidays has also generated controversy at various points. Christmas Who, the Season 2 Christmas special, depicts the citizens of Bikini Bottom encountering the concept of Christmas for the first time. SpongeBob introduces the holiday to the undersea world, and the episode follows the community's attempts to celebrate a tradition they do not fully understand. The episode was praised for its warmth and its emotional honesty, but it was also criticized by some viewers who felt that its depiction of Christmas was too secular, stripping the holiday of its religious significance and presenting it as a purely cultural phenomenon centered on gift-giving and community celebration. This criticism reflects a broader cultural debate about the secularization of holidays. Is Christmas a religious holiday or a cultural one? Can it be celebrated meaningfully without reference to its religious origins? SpongeBob answers these questions by presenting Christmas as a holiday about generosity, community, and the willingness to believe in something beautiful, even when evidence for that beauty is lacking. The show does not mention Jesus. It does not reference the Nativity. It presents Christmas as a story about Santa Claus and the spirit of giving. For viewers who consider Christmas primarily a religious holiday, this secularization is itself controversial. It suggests that the essence of Christmas can be extracted from its religious context and transplanted into a purely secular environment without losing anything essential. And this suggestion, whether intended or not, stakes a position in one of the most contentious cultural debates in America. The Halloween episodes have generated similar, if less intense, controversy. SpongeBob's Halloween specials depict the holiday as a celebration of fear, a night when it is acceptable and even desirable to be scared. This depiction conflicts with the beliefs of some religious communities that view Halloween as a celebration of the occult and that prohibit their children from participating. SpongeBob does not engage with these religious objections directly. It simply depicts Halloween as most Americans experience it, as a fun, slightly spooky holiday centered on costumes, candy, and ghost stories. But the very act of normalizing this depiction, of presenting it without qualm or caveat, is controversial for communities that hold a different view. The show's treatment of death extends beyond individual episodes. Kenny from South Park dies in every episode. Characters in Adventure Time face existential threats regularly. But SpongeBob handles death differently. Death in SpongeBob is both present and impossible. Characters face mortal danger, but cannot actually die. The show exists in a space where the concept of death is acknowledged, but its reality is denied. This creates an interesting philosophical paradox. The characters of Bikini Bottom live in a world where death exists as a concept, but not as a possibility. They can be afraid of dying. They can believe they are dying, but they cannot actually die. And this paradox mirrors the way children understand death, as something that happens to other people, in other places, at other times, but never to themselves, and never in the present. SpongeBob validates this understanding while gently undermining it. Episodes like Dying for Pie and Have You Seen This Snail introduce the possibility of permanent loss, allowing children to experience the emotion of grief within the safety of a fictional framework that will always, ultimately, restore what has been lost. The characters will be okay. The status quo will return, but the grief, however briefly felt, is genuine. And that brief encounter with genuine grief to see, for many children, their first experience of an emotion that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Let us also discuss the controversy surrounding the show's scientific accuracy, because SpongeBob has been both praised and criticized for its depiction of marine life. Steven Hillenburg was a marine biologist. He knew how marine organisms actually behave, and he deliberately chose to disregard most of what he knew in order to create a world that was funny rather than accurate. Fish walk on fins instead of swimming. Fire burns underwater. Characters breathe air despite living in an ocean. The rules of marine biology are violated constantly, consistently, and joyfully. Some marine biologists have praised the show for sparking children's interest in ocean life. Others have criticized it for creating misconceptions about marine ecosystems. A study published in 2014 found that children who watched SpongeBob had less accurate understanding of marine biology than children who did not, suggesting that the show's deliberate inaccuracies were being absorbed as fact. This is a legitimate concern. When a show becomes as ubiquitous as SpongeBob, its inaccuracies become cultural truths. Children grow up believing that fish can walk, that sponges can talk, that the ocean floor looks like a suburb. And while most children eventually learn the difference between cartoon physics and real physics, the initial impression lingers. But the counter-argument is that scientific accuracy was never the show's purpose. SpongeBob is not a nature documentary. It is a comedy. And expecting it to provide accurate marine biology is like expecting The Simpsons to provide accurate nuclear physics. The show uses the ocean as a setting, not as a curriculum. And the joy it has brought to millions of children is worth more, to most parents, than a few misconceptions about how sponges actually reproduce. The relationship between entertainment and education is one of the oldest debates in Western philosophy. Plato argued that art should serve education, that stories should teach moral and factual truths, and that art that entertains without educating is dangerous. Aristotle argued that art serves a different function than education, that its purpose is catharsis and emotional development rather than factual instruction, and that expecting art to be educational is a category error. Let us now discuss the controversy surrounding specific visual choices that the show has made, because some of SpongeBob's most debated moments are not about dialogue or plot, but about what appears on screen. The show has, throughout its run, included images that are designed to be jarring. Close-up shots of characters' faces, rendered in hyper-detailed, realistic styles, have been a recurring visual gag since the early seasons. These close-ups are deliberately ugly. They show wrinkles, pores, stubble, and blemishes that the show's normal animation style conceals. The effect is both funny and unsettling. A momentary break in the cartoon reality that reminds the viewer of the grotesque biological truth beneath every cute animated surface. These close-ups were controversial from the beginning. Some parents found them genuinely frightening for young viewers. The sudden shift from smooth, bright cartoon animation to detailed realistic rendering can be startling, especially for children who have not yet developed the ability to process sudden tonal shifts. But the close-ups serve a purpose. They are moments of truth. They say, beneath the cute exterior, this is what we actually look like. Beneath the smooth animation, there is biological reality. These moments puncture the illusion of the cartoon, reminding the audience that what they are watching is a construction, and that the real world, the world beneath the construction, is messy and imperfect and sometimes ugly. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote about the sublime, the aesthetic experience that arises when we encounter something that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The SpongeBob close-ups achieve a kind of inverse sublime. They are simultaneously ugly and hilarious. They repel and attract at the same time. And the mixed reaction they produce, the combination of disgust and laughter, is itself an aesthetic experience that enriches the show's emotional range. The show's use of real photographs as backgrounds, particularly in the early seasons, was another visual choice that generated discussion. Bikini Bottom is depicted against backgrounds that are clearly photographs of real undersea environments. The contrast between the hand-drawn characters and the photographic backgrounds creates a visual tension that most animated shows avoid. This visual tension was deliberate. Steven Hillenburg, as a marine biologist, wanted to ground the show's fantasy in visual reality. The photographic backgrounds say, this world is imagined, but it exists in a real place. The ocean floor that SpongeBob walks on is a real ocean floor. The rocks and coral that surround Bikini Bottom are real rocks and coral. The fantasy is built on a foundation of reality, and the visual tension between the two is a constant reminder of this foundation. The show's animation has also been controversial in how it handles the human body, or rather, the sponge body. SpongeBob's body is remarkably flexible. It stretches, compresses, deforms, fragments, and reassembles in ways that defy any physical logic. His body is, in the show's visual language, infinitely malleable. And this malleability has been used for both comedy and discomfort throughout the show's run. There are episodes where SpongeBob's body is treated as a source of horror rather than comedy. Episodes where his physical transformations go beyond slapstick into genuine body horror. The episode Face Freeze, from Season 8, depicts SpongeBob and Patrick making faces at each other until their faces become permanently frozen in grotesque expressions. The episode extends this premise for its full running time, and the result is an episode that many viewers found genuinely unpleasant rather than funny. The debate around body horror in SpongeBob reflects a broader debate about the boundaries of cartoon violence. In a cartoon, characters can be destroyed and rebuilt without consequence. Their bodies are not real. Their suffering is not real. And yet the visual depiction of that suffering can produce real discomfort in the viewer, even when the viewer knows that no one is actually being hurt. This is the paradox of empathy in fiction. We know that cartoon characters are not real. We know that their suffering is not real. And yet we respond to their suffering as though it were. We flinch when they are hurt. We feel discomfort when their bodies are distorted. We experience genuine emotional responses to events that we know, intellectually, have not happened. The philosopher Kendall Walton has written about this paradox, which he calls the paradox of fiction. Walton argues that our emotional responses to fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, responses that mimic the structure of real emotions without being fully real. We do not truly grieve for a fictional character. We experience something that resembles grief, but that lacks the full weight and consequence of actual grief. Whether Walton is right or wrong, the practical effect is the same. Viewers respond to SpongeBob's body horror with real discomfort. They may know, intellectually, that SpongeBob is a cartoon, but their bodies respond as though the suffering were real. Their stomachs turn, their faces scrunch, their hands move toward the remote. The discomfort is genuine, even if the cause is fictional. And this genuine discomfort is what makes body horror in SpongeBob controversial. It is not about whether the content is appropriate in the abstract. It is about whether the content produces a physical response in the viewer that the viewer did not consent to. When you watch a horror movie, you know what you're signing up for. When you watch SpongeBob, you expect a cheerful cartoon. And when that cheerful cartoon suddenly produces a visceral physical response, the violation of expectation is itself a form of discomfort. The show has navigated this territory with varying degrees of success. In the golden era, moments of visual discomfort were brief, well-timed, and always in service of a joke. In the post-movie era, they became more extended, more frequent, and sometimes more gratuitous, existing not to serve a joke, but to produce a reaction. The difference between these two approaches is the difference between a show that uses discomfort as a tool and a show that uses discomfort as a crutch. The golden era wielded discomfort with precision, deploying it at exactly the right moment for maximum comic effect. The post-movie era sometimes leaned on discomfort as a substitute for wit, producing episodes that were uncomfortable but not funny. SpongeBob sides with Aristotle. It does not try to educate. It tries to delight. And the education, such as it is a byproduct of the delight, absorbed incidentally rather than delivered intentionally. Children who watch SpongeBob may not learn accurate marine biology, but they learn something more important. They learn to laugh. They learn to care about characters who are different from them. They learn that the world is absurd and that the appropriate response to absurdity is not despair, but joy. And those lessons, while they may not appear on any science test, are lessons that will serve them for the rest of their lives. There is one final controversy that deserves attention, and it is the most recent, and in some ways the most significant. The controversy over whether SpongeBob SquarePants should still exist. After 25 years, 300 episodes, and the death of its creator, some fans and critics have argued that SpongeBob should be allowed to end, that the show has said everything it has to say, that continuing to produce new episodes without Hillenburg's guidance is a form of corporate exploitation that diminishes the show's legacy. Others disagree. They argue that SpongeBob belongs to the culture, not to any individual, and that new stories can honor the show's spirit while exploring new territory. They point to individual post-Hillenburg episodes that are genuinely excellent and argue that the show's best days may not be behind it. This debate is, at its core, a debate about endings, about when something should stop, about whether longevity is a virtue or a vice, about the difference between a show that has more to say and a show that is simply repeating itself. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote about the aesthetic stage of existence, in which a person lives for the pleasure of the moment, constantly seeking new experiences and new stimulations. Kierkegaard argued that this mode of existence, while initially exciting, eventually becomes exhausting, because the need for novelty is infinite, and the supply of genuinely new experiences is finite. A long-running television show faces the same challenge. It must constantly produce new episodes, new stories, new jokes, but the fundamental elements, the characters, the setting, the tonal range, are fixed. And the longer the show runs, the harder it becomes to produce something that feels genuinely new within these fixed constraints. SpongeBob has confronted this challenge for over 25 years, and while it has not always succeeded, the fact that it has continued to try, that it has continued to produce moments of genuine beauty and hilarity even after a quarter century of continuous production, is itself a kind of triumph. Not every episode is great. Not every season is the golden era, but the show is still alive. It is still trying. It is still, against all odds, producing moments that remind us why we fell in love with it in the first place. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the measure of a show's worth is not whether every episode is excellent, but whether the show, taken as a whole, has contributed something valuable to the culture. And by that measure, SpongeBob's contribution is enormous. It is incalculable. It is one of the defining cultural achievements of our time. Controversial? Yes. Imperfect? Absolutely. Important? Beyond question. Let us close with one final thought about what SpongeBob's controversies mean for the future of children's media. The landscape of children's entertainment is changing rapidly. Streaming services have replaced linear television as the primary delivery mechanism for children's content. Algorithms determine what children see, replacing the curatorial judgment of network programmers with the mathematical logic of engagement optimization. Content is produced in greater volume and consumed at greater speed than ever before. In this new landscape, controversy is both more likely and less consequential. More likely because the sheer volume of content means that more boundaries will be pushed, more taboos will be violated, and more cultural norms will be tested. Less consequential because the fragmentation of audiences means that no single piece of content has the cultural centrality that SpongeBob achieved. SpongeBob's controversies matter because SpongeBob matters. The show reached a level of cultural penetration that made its choices significant. When SpongeBob depicted a panty raid, millions of children saw it. When SpongeBob was censored, the censorship reflected the values of entire societies. The scale of the show's reach made its controversies culturally meaningful in a way that controversies around smaller, less successful shows simply are not. The future of children's media may not produce another SpongeBob. The conditions that allowed a single show to achieve such enormous cultural centrality, a limited number of channels, a shared viewing experience, a pre-streaming media landscape, may not exist again. And without that centrality, the controversies that attach to children's media will be smaller, more dispersed, and less culturally significant. But the questions that SpongeBob's controversies raised will persist. What should children see? What should they be protected from? How do we balance the desire to shield children from harm with the need to prepare them for a world that is not always harmless? These are permanent questions. They will be asked as long as adults make media for children, and the answers will continue to change as our culture continues to evolve. SpongeBob SquarePants did not resolve these questions. No show can, but it staged them with a clarity, a humor, and an honesty that few other shows have achieved. It showed us what happens when a children's cartoon takes risks. Sometimes the risks pay off, sometimes they do not. But the willingness to take them, the refusal to play it safe, the insistence on treating children as intelligent beings who can handle complexity and controversy, that willingness is the show's greatest legacy. Greater than any joke, greater than any character, greater than any individual episode, however brilliant or however flawed. The willingness to be controversial, because being controversial means being alive. And SpongeBob SquarePants, for all its faults and all its controversies, has never been anything less than magnificently, joyfully, stubbornly alive. Good night, sleep well. And remember that the most important things in life are always controversial, because the things that matter are the things that people care enough to argue about. And SpongeBob SquarePants has been argued about for over 25 years. Let us examine some more episodes that generated significant debate, because each one illuminates a different dimension of what our culture considers acceptable. The episode The Card, which aired on November 28, 2008, as part of Season 6, generated controversy for the way it depicted Patrick's behavior. In the episode, Patrick obtains a rare trading card that SpongeBob desperately wants. Patrick then proceeds to destroy the card through a series of increasingly careless actions, each one causing SpongeBob visible distress. The controversy was not about the plot itself, which is a standard comedic premise. It was about the interpretation of Patrick's behavior. In the Golden Era, Patrick's destructive actions were the result of genuine ignorance. He did not know he was causing harm. He was not malicious. He was simply unaware. In The Card, however, Patrick delivers a line that changed how many viewers understood his character. When SpongeBob points out that Patrick keeps destroying things, Patrick responds with words to the effect that he knows what he's doing. This line implied that Patrick's destruction was deliberate rather than accidental, that he was not innocently bumbling. He was knowingly inflicting pain. This small moment of dialogue transformed a beloved character from a lovable fool into a potential sadist, and the backlash was intense. Fans argued that the line was inconsistent with Patrick's established character, that a Patrick who knowingly causes pain is fundamentally different from the Patrick of the Golden Era. that the writers had crossed a line from comedy into cruelty. The debate around the card reflects a broader conversation about how characters should be treated by their creators. Characters in long-running shows develop a kind of gravity, a set of established traits and behaviors that the audience comes to expect. When writers violate these expectations, the audience feels betrayed, not because the violation is objectively wrong, but because it disrupts the relationship of trust that has been built between the audience and the character over years of consistent behavior. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about narrative identity, the idea that identity is constituted by the stories we tell about ourselves and others. Patrick's narrative identity, as established over the first 3 seasons, was that of a lovable, innocent, accidentally destructive friend. The card attempted to revise this narrative identity, and the audience rejected the revision because it was inconsistent with the story they had internalized. The episode Pet or Pests, which aired on March 18th, 2009 as part of Season 6, generated controversy for a different reason. The episode depicts SpongeBob finding baby worms and attempting to find homes for them. The baby worms are grotesque, covered in slime, and generally unpleasant. The episode relies heavily on the audience's disgust at the worm's appearance for its comedy. The controversy was partly about the episode's visual unpleasantness, but more deeply about its message. The worms are rejected by everyone SpongeBob approaches because they are ugly. The episode can be read as a commentary on how our society treats those who do not conform to standards of beauty or normalcy. The worms are not dangerous. They are not harmful. They are simply ugly. And their ugliness is enough to make them unwanted. This is a powerful message, but it is delivered in a way that undermines itself. The episode seems to want the audience to sympathize with the worms, but it also goes out of its way to make the worms as repulsive as possible. The result is a mixed message. We are told we should accept the ugly, but we are shown the ugly in a way that is designed to make us recoil. The episode asks for empathy while simultaneously provoking disgust. This internal contradiction is characteristic of some of the post-movie era's weakest episodes. They attempt to deliver meaningful messages, but sabotage those messages through their execution. The intention is good, but the craft is not equal to the intention. The episode Stuck in the Ringer, which aired on July 19th, 2009, as part of Season 6, is one of the most polarizing episodes in the show's history. In the episode, SpongeBob gets stuck in a ringer, a cylindrical device that prevents him from moving his arms. Patrick attempts to help by gluing the ringer permanently to SpongeBob's body. SpongeBob spends the rest of the episode unable to perform basic tasks, and when he expresses his frustration, the townspeople of Bikini Bottom tell him that his crying is ruining everyone else's good time. The episode was controversial because it seemed to blame the victim. SpongeBob is stuck in a ringer through no fault of his own. He is in genuine distress, and the response of his community is not sympathy but irritation. The message, whether intended or not, seemed to be that people in distress should keep their suffering to themselves rather than burdening others with it. This is a harmful message, and it was recognized as such by many viewers. The idea that a person in pain should suppress their distress to avoid inconveniencing others is precisely the kind of toxic positivity that mental health advocates have been working to counteract. And seeing this message delivered in a SpongeBob episode, a show that millions of children watch and absorb, was deeply concerning to many parents and critics. The episode Little Yellow Book, which aired on March 2nd, 2013, as part of Season 9, depicted Squidward reading SpongeBob's diary aloud to the customers of the Krusty Krab. The episode was controversial not for the reading itself, which is a standard comedic premise, but for the community's response. After reading the diary, Squidward is shunned by the entire town for invading SpongeBob's privacy. But then the townspeople read the diary themselves and find it hilarious. They condemn Squidward for doing exactly what they then proceed to do. The episode is a sharp satire of moral hypocrisy. People condemn behavior in others that they practice themselves. They claim moral superiority while engaging in the same transgressions they denounce. The satire is effective, but it was also criticized by some viewers who felt that the episode's moral confusion was unintentional rather than intentional, and that the writers had simply failed to resolve the hypocrisy rather than deliberately highlighting it. The episode The Sewers of Bikini Bottom, which aired on November 11th, 2015, as part of Season 10, explored the literal underbelly of Bikini Bottom by sending SpongeBob and Squidward into the town's sewer system. The episode depicted the sewers as a grotesque, dangerous environment filled with hazards and horrifying creatures. The episode was controversial primarily for its visual intensity. The sewer environment was more graphically unpleasant than typical SpongeBob settings, and some parents felt that the episode pushed beyond the boundaries of what was appropriate for the show's target audience. The episode also contained implications about pollution and environmental degradation that, while not overtly political, carried a message about the hidden costs of urban living. Let us now examine the show's controversial moments through the lens of international reception, because the way different cultures respond to SpongeBob tells us as much about those cultures as it does about the show. In Japan, SpongeBob has been popular, but has required significant adaptation. Japanese broadcasting standards differ from American ones, and certain types of humor that are considered acceptable in the United States, particularly humor involving physical violence and body functions, are more strictly regulated in Japanese children's programming. SpongeBob episodes broadcast in Japan have been edited to reduce the intensity of physical comedy and to remove or soften scenes that Japanese regulators consider too violent for young audiences. This is ironic, given that Japanese animation is often perceived by Western audiences as more intense and more willing to depict violence than Western animation. But the perception is misleading. Japanese animation for children, as opposed to animation aimed at teenagers and adults, tends to be gentler and more restrained than American children's animation in its depiction of physical comedy. In Russia, SpongeBob has been one of the most popular Western animated shows, but it has also been the subject of political controversy. In 2013, a Russian psychological research institute published a report claiming that SpongeBob was harmful to children's development, arguing that the show's frenetic pace and surreal humor could damage attention spans and emotional regulation. The report was widely covered in Russian media and was interpreted by some as part of a broader cultural effort to reduce Western cultural influence in Russia. In the Middle East, SpongeBob has been adapted for Arabic-speaking audiences with cultural modifications that go beyond simple translation. Character names are changed, cultural references are adapted, and content that conflicts with Islamic values, including depictions of romantic relationships, certain types of physical comedy, and references to holidays like Halloween and Christmas, is removed or altered. The most significant adaptation in Middle Eastern markets is the removal of romantic content. Any suggestion of romantic attraction between characters is cut, including scenes that Western audiences would consider entirely innocent. This reflects a broader cultural norm in many Middle Eastern societies that children should not be exposed to romantic content of any kind, even the mild, comedic variety that SpongeBob presents. In India, SpongeBob has been enormously popular, but has also been the subject of parental concern. Indian parents have expressed worry about the show's influence on children's behavior, particularly its depiction of disobedience, its mockery of authority figures, and its celebration of unconventional behavior. These concerns mirror the concerns expressed by American parents, but are amplified by cultural values that place a stronger emphasis on respect for elders and obedience to authority. In China, SpongeBob has been available through various platforms, but has been subject to the same content regulations that govern all foreign media. Chinese broadcasting regulations restrict content that is considered harmful to minors, and SpongeBob episodes have been edited to comply with these regulations. The specific edits vary, but generally target content that Chinese regulators consider too violent, too irreverent, or too culturally specific to Western values. The global pattern of SpongeBob censorship reveals a fundamental truth about children's media. There is no universal standard for what children should see. Every culture has its own anxieties, its own taboos, its own assumptions about what is harmful and what is harmless. And SpongeBob, by existing in all of these cultures simultaneously, exposes the differences between them with unusual clarity. The show is a constant. The same episodes, the same characters, the same stories, but the reception is a variable. Each culture receives the show through its own filter, accepting some elements and rejecting others. And the pattern of acceptance and rejection is a portrait of the culture's deepest values and deepest fears. This is why SpongeBob's controversies matter. Not because any individual controversy is particularly important, but because the sum of all controversies, across all cultures, across all 25 years of the show's run, is a comprehensive map of what humanity considers sacred and what it considers dangerous. And that map, drawn in the language of a cartoon about a sponge, is one of the most revealing documents of our time. The controversy around animated body horror in children's shows has intensified in recent years, with parents and advocacy groups expressing increasing concern about the intensity of visual content in media aimed at young audiences. SpongeBob has not been the primary target of this concern, which has more often focused on shows with more extreme visual styles. But the show has contributed to the broader conversation about what children should and should not be shown. The episode Chocolate with Nuts, which aired on June 1st, 2002, as part of Season 3, is universally beloved and almost never controversial. But it contains an element that deserves examination. The character who chases SpongeBob and Patrick throughout the episode, screaming about chocolate, is depicted as manic, obsessive, and potentially dangerous. His behavior is clearly irrational. He is driven by a desire so intense that it overwhelms all other considerations. This character, known simply as the Chocolate Guy, has become one of the show's most iconic figures. His screaming pursuit of chocolate has been memed, remixed, and referenced millions of times. And yet, if we step back from the comedy, what we are seeing is a depiction of addiction. The Chocolate Guy is not just enthusiastic about chocolate. He is compulsive. He cannot control himself. His desire has consumed his personality and his rational faculties. The show plays this for laughs, and it works as comedy because the absurdity of the situation, a grown man chasing two children through a city while screaming about chocolate, is genuinely funny. But the underlying dynamic, the loss of control, the overwhelming desire, the complete subjugation of reason to appetite, is the dynamic of addiction. And the fact that we laugh at it tells us something about how our culture processes the reality of compulsive behavior. We laugh because the object of the obsession is trivial. Chocolate is not a dangerous substance. A man screaming about chocolate is funny in a way that a man screaming about heroin would not be. The comedy depends on the mismatch between the intensity of the desire and the innocuousness of the thing desired. But the structure of the obsession, the way it overrides all other considerations, is the same regardless of the object. And the episode, without intending to, provides one of the most accurate depictions of compulsive behavior in any medium. The episode Sailor Mouth's depiction of profanity has been discussed extensively, but there is one more aspect of the episode that deserves attention. The episode ends with Mrs. Puff accidentally using one of the forbidden words, and the characters react with the same exaggerated shock that has greeted every previous utterance of the word throughout the episode. But Mrs. Puff is an authority figure. She is a teacher, and her use of the word carries a different weight than SpongeBob and Patrick's use of it. When children use profanity, it is treated as a learning moment. When adults use profanity, it is treated as a character flaw. And when authority figures use profanity, it destabilizes the moral hierarchy that places them above the people they are supposed to guide. Mrs. Puff's profanity is shocking, not because the word itself is shocking, but because the person saying it is supposed to be above such language. This moment captures something true about how language and power interact. Profanity is not just about words. It is about who has permission to use them. Children are forbidden from using certain words. Adults use them freely. Authority figures are expected to refrain, and when these expectations are violated, the violations reveal the hidden hierarchy of linguistic power that governs every community. Let us also examine the controversies that arose, not from individual episodes, but from the show's broader cultural positioning. SpongeBob SquarePants has been at the center of several cultural debates that have nothing to do with any specific episode and everything to do with what the show represents. The most significant of these was the 2005 controversy involving Dr. James Dobson and Focus on the Family. Dobson accused a video featuring SpongeBob and other cartoon characters of promoting a pro-homosexual agenda. The video, produced by the We Are Family Foundation, was designed to promote tolerance and diversity among children. It featured SpongeBob alongside Barney, Winnie the Pooh, and other beloved children's characters. Dobson's accusation was widely ridiculed. Late-night comedians mocked the idea that a cartoon sponge could have a sexual orientation. The mainstream media treated the controversy as a joke, but the controversy revealed something important about the cultural weight that SpongeBob carries. If SpongeBob were a minor character, Dobson would not have bothered to mention him. His inclusion of SpongeBob in his critique was a tacit acknowledgement that SpongeBob is culturally significant enough to be a factor in the ongoing debate about values and identity in American society. The controversy also revealed the extent to which certain cultural communities view children's media as a battlefield. For Dobson and his supporters, the tolerance video was not just a video. It was a strategic move in a cultural war, an attempt to use beloved children's characters to normalize values that Dobson's community considers harmful. The fact that the video's actual content was anodyne, promoting basic messages about kindness and acceptance, was irrelevant. What mattered was the context. The fact that a tolerance video featuring SpongeBob was being distributed to schools, which Dobson interpreted as an attempt to influence children's attitudes toward homosexuality. The philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote about cultural hegemony, the process by which dominant cultural narratives are maintained not through force, but through the gradual infiltration of ideas into everyday life. Gramsci argued that the most effective form of ideological control is the kind that does not look like control. It looks like entertainment. It looks like fun. It looks like a cartoon about a sponge. Dobson's critique, stripped of its specific religious content, is a Gramscian critique. He is arguing that children's media is not neutral, that the values embedded in cartoons and videos and songs are ideological, whether their creators intend them to be or not. That by presenting tolerance and diversity as self-evident goods, the video is making an ideological argument that is disguised as entertainment. Whether you agree with Dobson or not, his underlying insight has merit. Children's media does transmit values. SpongeBob does promote certain ways of seeing the world: tolerance, kindness, emotional openness, skepticism toward authority. These are not neutral values. They are ideological positions. And the fact that they are embedded in a cartoon, rather than stated in a manifesto, makes them more rather than less powerful, because they are absorbed without the resistance that explicit ideological messaging provokes. SpongeBob is ideological. Every show is ideological. The question is not whether children's media contains ideology, but whether the ideology it contains is one we want our children to absorb. And the answer to that question depends entirely on who is answering it, which is why SpongeBob will continue to be controversial for as long as it continues to exist. The Nickelodeon Pride Month tweet of June 2020, in which the network appeared to identify SpongeBob as a member of the LGBTQ community, reignited the debate about SpongeBob's sexuality. The tweet featured SpongeBob alongside other Nickelodeon characters who had been identified as LGBTQ, including Korra from The Legend of Korra. The implication, whether intended or not, was that SpongeBob was being added to this group. The tweet was celebrated by LGBTQ advocates and criticized by those who felt that assigning a sexual identity to a children's cartoon character was inappropriate. Steven Hillenburg had previously stated that SpongeBob was asexual, and some fans felt that Nickelodeon's tweet contradicted the creator's stated intention. The debate illuminated the tension between a creator's intent and a culture's interpretation. Hillenburg said SpongeBob was asexual, but the culture, or at least a significant portion of it, had already decided otherwise. SpongeBob's emotional openness, his close male friendships, his flamboyant personality, these traits had been interpreted as queer by millions of viewers, and Nickelodeon's tweet seemed to validate that interpretation. This is the fate of any cultural icon. Once a character becomes sufficiently famous, they cease to belong to their creator and begin to belong to the culture. The culture assigns meanings that the creator may not have intended and may not endorse, and the character becomes a site of projection, a canvas onto which millions of people paint their own identities, their own desires, and their own politics. SpongeBob is this kind of canvas. He is big enough to contain multiple interpretations. He is flexible enough to support contradictory readings. He is, in the end, whatever the person watching him needs him to be. And the controversy that surrounds him is not a failure of the show, but a consequence of its success. A character who can be all things to all people will inevitably be the subject of disagreement about what exactly he is. The show's entire approach to language is philosophically interesting. SpongeBob is a show that pays attention to how words are used. Characters are precise in their speech. Jokes often depend on the exact phrasing of a line. The show treats language as a tool that can be wielded with precision or deployed carelessly, and the consequences of careless language are a recurring theme. This attention to language is itself controversial in a culture that increasingly treats language as trivial. Social media has accelerated the production and consumption of language to the point where individual words carry less weight than they once did. We produce more language than ever before, and we attend to it less than ever before. SpongeBob, by treating language as something that matters, by building entire episodes around the power of a single word, pushes back against this devaluation. And that, like so many other aspects of SpongeBob SquarePants, is quietly radical. A children's cartoon that insists words matter, that insists the way we speak to each other has consequences, that insists language is not just a tool for communication, but a tool for creation, destruction, comedy, and truth. That is not a problem. That is a legacy.